Hello, welcome. This is Chris Morgan. This is the 9th video, although our numbers might be slightly off, in our Reactor Subtractive Synth series. In this episode, I'd like to continue making some macros, and in the following episode, we will do the filter. So in the previous video, we introduced the idea of macros. There are some places where we can make some more macros now to encapsulate the vibrato and encapsulate the envelope generator, and I'll show you a couple of graphical things and just to cement and reinforce the idea of macros. So what we'll do is, looking at our let's start with the envelope generator, the attack, decay, sustain, release. We will encapsulate that in a macro just because it's loose in the same larger macro, the VCA. So I'll open up the VCA and we see the envelope generator here. So again, to create a macro, go to right click or control click and macro, one in, one out. It puts an empty macro there. We will select the envelope generator, double click, paste. We only need to hook up the output and try to grab that again. And then we could delete the input since we don't really need that. And I think it helps with just clarity. And double click anywhere to go back up a level, and then we will attach the macro to where the envelope generator was. Delete that, and now everything's fine. And we can now call this ADSR or EG. Now, one nice thing, looking down here, we see it's inside of its own box. If we double click on the macro and bring up the ADSR is a unique object in that it has a visual component as well. If I click one time on it, I bring up its preference pane to the left, and you can see under view that there is a visible. If I click visible, now I can see a graphical representation of the envelope generator. So as I adjust those values, it gives me a graphical representation of what's going on, which is nice. We can't edit that per se here, which is unfortunate, but it is nice to have that. Now there's a couple of things. The way it's arranged now to the side there is fine, but what I like to do is click on the wrench and put this above the settings, and notice that it's too small. It doesn't stretch across the whole length of those controls. So I'm going to do a couple of things. Well, first I can just make it the same size. So I click on it one time, and you can see over here under its style, the width is set to 100. 100 pixels. I'll set it to 150, and notice that it stretches to the full length. If real estate is important, then I could shrink maybe the knobs themselves, so I can select each knob and set it to medium size, and that might give me a little bit more room because we are running up against the space issue here. The idea here is that I want to get one of these macros perfect, and then I can copy and paste that macro over and over. So I'm going to go back to my ADSR and maybe try it at 125 pixels, maybe 135. I've not done this size before. That looks fine. And then I don't need it to be 52 pixels high. Maybe I'll try 40 pixels high. So now we've got a smaller version, and then it will also look nice to have that graphical representation. I don't necessarily need the ADSR-EMB now, so I can just say to not show that label and have the ADSR there. And then finally on the macro itself, I really like the 3D frames, even though it takes up more space. So now I have this. It takes up a little more space, but it's worth it because of the nicer display there. The same thing with the LFO. It's not necessary all these things go together, but in terms of later just copying pasting one LFO macro, it's going to be nicer. So I'm going to double click to go up a level, control click to bring in another one in, one out module macro, and notice that this one is a bipolar. I'm a unipolar, so that's significant because that'll come up a little later. We will need this whole thing to do our filter cutoff frequency modulation. So there's that. Right now it's tremolo. And I will hook this up and then delete the old and then give this a name, which would be just tremolo probably. Give it a 3D frame, and there, it looks nice there. I could make these medium size as well. And tighten that up. And then of course, again, if space is way more of a concern, maybe I'll switch that from being buttons to being a menu and put this on top like that. So figuring out some way to make things tight and real estate friendly, because space does become a concern, especially when you're working in the host mode and you've got the windows of the host DAW environment to fight with. So that's enough for that. What I could do to make things really fast is I'll just copy this tremolo one, go up into my VCO, into pitch, and where we have this LFO, I will go ahead and just replace that one. And I'll need to remember that inside of here, this is actually going to be a bipolar. And as you recall, we had set the depth to 2 instead of just 1, plus or minus 1. And then of course would be nice to change this to vibrato. And now very quickly I've got another nice macro set. Now I needed to change the name of that macro, of course, to vibrato, back to pitch instead of tremolo. And it's nice. And then we have one more of these to do. We need to do the pulse width modulation. So again, in here I'll paste that tremolo, and we notice some changes here. In this case it might be better just to put this in a macro rather than fix the other. So I'm making a decision here to not fix all those things. I'm just going to make a new macro, and again, only so I can have the 3D frame and the nicer labeling. Okay, so that's done, and give it a name, which pulse width modulation. Delete the old unmacro version, put in the macro version, and now let's go back to our VCO. We see we have 2 PWMs there, and actually that was a little bit redundant, I suppose. Yeah, we'd already done that one, so that was kind of silly. Let's back that up. I'll just take this one out and paste it back in here, since that was totally redundant to do that. Okay, so now we've got our pulse width modulation. We've got identical looking vibrato and tremolo settings, and clean this up just a little bit. And next we're going to make the video, or do the video on the filter stuff, which would go right here.